Good morning and afternoon and evening, everyone, and very warm greetings from Stockholm. My name is Henrik Hammargren, and I'm the Executive Director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and it's my sincere pleasure to be the chair and the moderator of this roundtable in the Academic Council on the United Nations, ACANS, and its 2021 annual meeting. ACANS is an independent non-profit association of scholars, practitioners, institutions, and individuals, all active in the work and study of the UN. And let me start by recognizing that as of 2021, ACANS operates in a new way. It's an independent non-profit organization, and thank you all that made this change possible. This paves way for a much more sustainable and effective setup. So thank you very much. Well, for those of you who do not know the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, the foundation is an autonomous, non-governmental and non-grant giving organization that was established by the Swedish Parliament actually 60 years ago, since the tragic death of Hammarskjöld in a plane crash in Ndola, Zambia, on a mission try to mediate in the conflict in the Congo. And we work to advance dialogue and policy for sustainable development, building on Hammarskjöld's legacy. And as part of this work, the foundation is exploring both challenges and opportunities concerning UN leadership, and very much with a focus on international civil service. So please turn to our webpage if you're interested to learn more, and you will also find links to recent publications on leadership there. Now, let me turn to the topic of this roundtable. What I want all us to remember is that this is a recorded session, and we will not follow Chatham House rule this time. The topic of this roundtable is diversity and representation in the United Nations. And we will, over the next 75 minutes, learn from 4 distinguished persons with in-depth knowledge about the UN. And we will also have 30 minutes approximately for a Q&A session. So please use the chat function, and I will do my best to integrate what you put there and sort of bring this up for comments or during the session. Well, let's turn to the topic, and the most natural and perhaps also useful point of departure in this discussion is, of course, sort of the UN Charter itself, and its first 3 words, we the peoples. This leads, of course, to the question on how the organization reflects this notion. Over the last decades, calls have increased for greater representation and diversity at the UN. And it's also been broadened to include race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and disabilities. These calls have also intensified in light of social movements and also increasingly triggered by deepened inequalities and discrimination. This, of course, raises expectations on UN internal policies and its leadership, who must live up to the standards on sort of follow the global developments and also demonstrate progress. So this roundtable will consider how representation and diversity in the international service impact on trust in the UN and also on perceptions on its relevance and its legitimacy. So with that, I'm very proud and pleased to introduce our 4 speakers. Ms. Martha Helena Lopez, Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources at the UN. We also have Hannah Davies, researcher at Ulster University with us from Northern Ireland, and Dr. Anna Maria Goetz, clinical professor at the Center for Global Affairs, New York University, and Lysa John, Secretary General CIVICUS. We might also, and we will see how that goes, we might have with us the former president of the United Nations General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa of Ecuador, and I will find out later if she is able to join us, because I didn't see whether she had logged on. Oh, now I see you. Thank you very much for coming with us, Maria. That's great. Thank you very much for logging on.
I'm here, and greetings to all.
Great. Well, as sort of invited speakers, they will all reflect on both progress and obstacles, and 3 questions will sort of guide this discussion. And the first is sort of, how does representation and diversity in the international civil service impact on both trust in the UN and on perceptions of relevance and legitimacy? The second question is sort of, what progress have the UN made in terms of improving representation and increasing the diversity among its staff? And thirdly, where and why is progress lagging? What are the reasons and what are the obstacles to increase a fair representation? So with this introduction and trying to save some time here, making sure that we will have sort of an interactive discussion, let me start by turning to you, ASG, Martha, Helena, Lopez. Where would you say today the UN is in terms of both diversity and representation? The scene, or perhaps I should say the screen, is yours. So Martha, Helena, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience. I would like first, before responding to the 3 questions in general, to start by expressing my gratitude and our gratitude to the Academic Council of the United Nations System for this invitation and for the opportunity to be part of this panel discussing the issue of diversity and representation in the United Nations. So first, I will cover a bit of a general that covers all 3 questions, and perhaps afterwards I'll highlight.
I think I have a problem there. Could you please try to unmute and mute again?
Mrs. Lopez,
and
we can't
will
hear
see
you.
if we can reconnect.
I'm not sure if it's only me, but you were breaking up.
Is it okay now?
Now we can hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay, so shall I start again, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, so you didn't hear anything?
No, so please go ahead and start.
Okay, good. All right, so good afternoon and good evening to everyone, to this global audience. Before I respond to the questions, I wanted to first express our gratitude and my gratitude to the Academic Council of the United Nations System for this invitation and for the opportunity to be part of this panel and share our experience on diversity and representation in the United Nations. I would cover a bit of the 3 questions in general, and then I will highlight 1 or 2 things of either of the questions. First, diversity is one of our core values in the United Nations, and the principle of equitable representation in our workforce is fundamental. And as you have in a few minutes back indicated, is part of the tenet of our charter since its inception. We believe that our workforce should reflect the diversity of our member states and the world in which we operate. And we also believe that a diverse and a representative workforce is central to tackling a complex global mandate. Historically, at the UN, diversity and representation has been observed through a dual lens of gender and geography. However, in recent years, we have expanded our diversity and inclusion efforts to address the inclusion of other key underrepresented groups in the workforce, including persons with disabilities, the LGBTQI+ community, and youth. And guided by this central concept of leaving no one behind, we have developed a number of policies, strategies, tools, and measures aiming to building a more diverse and inclusive workforce where everyone feels valued and is able to reach their full potential. I would like to highlight also that building a sustaining, diverse, inclusive workforce requires a systematic and intentional approach on two fronts. The first is to actively attract and recruit candidates from underrepresented groups. And the second is to build an enabling and inclusive culture where everyone has the opportunity to participate on an equal basis. Under the leadership of our Secretary General, progress has been made in the UN Secretariat, and particularly in terms of achieving gender parity. At the same time, we recognize that there is a lot of work still to be done, and we are fully committed to this. On the first question regarding representation and diversity and the trust that we have in the UN and the perception of legitimacy, is because we believe that to remain credible, the United Nations must ensure that the workforce reflects the diversity, and that we should be walking the talk regarding that diversity in our international civil service. Some of the highlights that I can indicate is the priority of rebalancing the geographical representation, but also looking at regional representation in this regard. In terms of issues that are lagging behind, what I would like to highlight is that we have been in recent years expanding the concept of diversity, and also looking at identity and the backgrounds of all our personnel in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of disability, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, among others. And one of the challenges that we are having now, and we have had in the past, but particularly it became more evident last year with COVID-19, was that we were not attracting the underrepresented groups in the sufficient manner that we needed to have. So we are trying to increase and address the obstacles that are coming from those underrepresented groups, and particularly looking at our processes, looking how we post our openings, how we evaluate, how we assess, how we interview, and then until we take the final decision. The areas where we continue to have challenges in attracting underrepresented groups is particularly for locations that are non-family locations, field missions, and just to give an example, the pool of candidates that come from a non-family duty station in terms of gender is normally 20% female applicants compared to 80% male applicants. So that is something that reflects that if we don't have a good pool of candidates coming in, then we are not able to address the diversity that we need going forward. Another area that I would like to highlight that we are trying to address is the issue of race. And in this regard, I'm pleased to share with you that the Secretary General launched a campaign for dialogue and action aimed at combating racism and promoting dignity within the organization, and has established a task force in order to eradicate racism and promoting dignity for all at our workplace. And this task force will be recommending a strategic plan to the Secretary General to be implemented in 2022 and beyond. So perhaps I'll stop there at this point in time and turn it over to you, and I'm open to answer any questions or further elaborate on some of the issues of this important subject. Thank you.
Henrik, you have to unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Martha, Helena. That's very interesting. Can I just quickly turn to just a few questions? I mean, I fully agree that the Secretary General's system-wide strategy on gender parity has made very much progress, and especially in the senior management group and among the RCs and the resident coordinators. But there are so many other levels and the organizations, and you pointed out to a few of these things, but especially when you look at mid-management and also at country level, you know, some of this you've explained around sort of with the whole challenges around the country situations and non-family postings. But what, in your view, are sort of keeping this dimension or part of the system still from having, you know, more achievements when it comes to gender parity?
Thank you for that question. I think it continues to be the pool of candidates that we have, and particularly the pool of external candidates that we have, because when we look at the numbers, those who are already internal and we move them around will not change the overall numbers. It's really the pool of candidates coming externally that change the numbers. And if there are in some areas, for example, in IT, in security, that attracting the right pool of external candidates that we need, in particularly at the lower levels, and where we can groom them up to be leadership, that is the challenge that we're having. So we are going to universities, we are going to different groups in order to encourage them to prepare in order to be able to apply in the future. We have instituted some measures, and particularly those entities that do not have gender parity at the different levels. If they want to select a male candidate over a female candidate, they do need to make a recommendation to the executive office of the SG. And the cases that we have seen normally, either the candidate is really the best candidate for the position, or sometimes there are no recommended female candidates because the pool was not there. And it mainly comes from non-family duty stations that we are seeing the situation more continues to be relevant. But sometimes we are seeing managers already changing their behavior and saying, look, I can move this person to this post, but for this post, I already have viable candidates, external viable candidates that coming in. So managers are starting to do more workforce planning and foreseeing where are the groups where you can see that we can bring more female candidates within the organization. So it's a collective effort. It cannot be an effort only of human resources. It's a collective effort between the people that are helping with the job openings, with the assessment and others, but also the effort of managers and senior leaders in order to drive the agenda.
Thank you very much. And we'll hear more about this from Anne-Marie as well. But let's first just turn to Dr. Hannah Davies. Hannah, you study theories on representative systems and how representation can contribute to more legitimate and accountable and effective bureaucracy. But how does these theories sort of relate to the UN, and what sort of, I know you're also focusing very much on key tensions and contradiction that UN faces in terms of achieving sort of a more representative bureaucracy. For many, bureaucracies is a negative word, but it's actually a core part of any institution. So please help us to shed some more light on this. Over to you, Hannah.
Okay, thank you, Henrik. And I should probably say that I feel like I'm still not really an academic. I think you've promoted me in that regard. And actually, before I took up this kind of academic research game, I spent 15 years working at the UN, where I did work with Marta Helena. And I have to say, I think she has the most difficult job in the world. It's not easy what she has to reconcile. I've put together some remarks to answer some of those questions, and if it's not a presentation, but I'll kind of read through and hopefully they'll make sense. But yes, representative bureaucracy, I think it's a kind of common sense view that organisations, particularly public organisations, should in some senses represent the public they serve. And this is important for equity, but I think it also reflects the idea that a more representative bureaucracy is also more legitimate and more effective. And there's an extensive body of academic work on representative bureaucracy that looks at these questions, and some of the audience are, I know, familiar with that. Now, most work on representative bureaucracy has looked at national administrations, and it's been far less applied to organisations like the UN. There is now some important work being done, including by Fanny Badash, who I see is in the audience, and it's mostly focused on national representation. It doesn't really look at other aspects of diversity. And I think the focus on nationality reflects a large degree the kind of data that's available on international civil servants. There isn't a great kind of granularity of data available. But I also think it says something about the type of public that the UN is perceived to serve and the UN's relationship with this public. At the national or local level, a public service like education, there's a much closer relationship between the public servant, say the teacher, and their students. So if the teacher doesn't speak the same language as the children in their class, it's highly unlikely that the teachers will represent their students in the sense of being like them, but they also won't be very effective teachers. And in the representative bureaucracy literature, public servants like teachers, police officers, social workers are referred to as street level bureaucrats. Now, I think the UN Secretariat is not especially street level, right? I think that the popular image of the UN bureaucrat would probably be of an elite, well-educated, cosmopolitan professional. So in many ways, not at all representative of the broader public, the we the peoples. And I think this possibly has wider implications for the UN's legitimacy. And in this regard, if I may, I wanted to tell a story from way, way back before I even worked for the UN, many, many years ago, when I was working in schools in inner London. And these were children from many different cultural backgrounds, refugee children, high levels of poverty and deprivation. And one day I went to a careers briefing that was being given by a senior staff member of an international NGO talking about careers in development. And he used the idea of circles of responsibility to suggest that those of us who want to work internationally, we not only care about our own family and community, but we must feel a responsibility for the whole world. And this sense of global responsibility, he called it the humanitarian impulse, and the desire to help people in faraway places that are seemingly nothing like you, he argued that this was an essential component for an international career. Now, even back then, before I think the whole idea of decolonizing development had become more mainstream, it really struck me that this talk was being given to a room full of postgraduate students in one of the poorest areas of London, right next door to one of the schools I was working in. And there's no shortage of internationally related issues on our own doorstep, but also require a humanitarian response. But you don't necessarily have to travel halfway around the world to find them. And of course, UN staff are not teachers. And the work of the UN Secretariat has tended to involve more things like servicing meetings, convening conferences, developing policy documents. And these are a different kind of public good for a different kind of public. And this has historically been diplomats, other member state representatives. Again, generally speaking, elite bureaucrats drawn from quite a narrow stratum of the population. However, I'd say in the last 30 years or so, actually probably longer, the scope and scale of what the UN does has expanded, particularly in the area of peace and security, with challenges to the legitimacy of the UN, not only in terms of representation, but also in terms of skills. And in UN peace operations, for example, staff have to work in prisons, they have to work supporting police services. It's a different set of functions than traditional conference servicing. And it also requires working with different kinds of publics who are probably less elite, less cosmopolitan, if you like. So of course, the UN is an internationally diverse organisation. Having staff from all nationalities is important and essential to its legitimacy. But I think national diversity is only one element of what it might mean to represent the public that the UN serves. And as Marta Helena has said, the Secretariat, the Secretary General has more recently really focused on gender and other kinds of issues. But I think you also have to think of other components of diversity and questions of kind of access and social class. So in my first UN job in Geneva, I was working with people from all over the world, from Argentina, from Ghana, from France, but most of them seem to have been to the London School of Economics. So in what sense were they diverse and who was being represented there? So here are just some other things to think about in terms of what it means to have a more diverse UN staff. Also, just in terms of tensions, all of these things are compounded by the way that human resources in the UN Secretariat are actually a site for political struggle, both within the Secretariat and between and among the member states. So firstly, within the UN Secretariat, there are clear hierarchies of representation. There are different types of contracts and different kinds of conditions. And some posts are more prestigious and competitive than others. So you don't tend to get member states fighting over a low-level admin position. General service staff, administrative staff are in most cases unable to apply for professional jobs. And I know there's efforts to deal with that, and there's lots of politics around that. And so general service staff don't necessarily get the international benefits and other things, which creates inequalities and frustrations. And I think notably, the Secretary General's gender parity strategy does not apply to administrative positions, because at least at headquarters, there are more women in general service positions, which I think speaks to the gendered division of labour within the Secretariat and how certain jobs and functions are feminised, which is quite separate from issues of gender parity. There are also politics within the staff unions, including over issues such as downsizing, which can conflict with and challenge gender parity targets, which I think Anne-Marie might talk about. And I think the second area of tension is decision-making in the General Assembly, which is highly politicised. Human resources discussions are connected to broader admin and budget issues, and these reveal real cleavages among member states, not only about national interest, like having more staff, but also about the authority of the Secretary General to make decisions. And while these reflect real questions of real politics, they can also have an ideational dimension in relation to who should be represented. So, for example, in 2015, there was opposition in the General Assembly to the Secretary General issuing a revised administrative instruction that recognised same-sex partners as being entitled to benefits. So while it's great that there are these efforts to be more inclusive and to be more diverse and LGBTQ+, the politics around those issues in the General Assembly are not always straightforward. The Fifth Committee is a universal committee of all member states, which allows smaller and developing countries in coalition as the G77 to have quite significant influence over staffing policies, which they may not get on other questions. So quite often positions taken by the G77 might be in opposition to the more managerial agenda of donor countries, which is often focused on cost efficiency, modernisation, and initiatives such as flexible working space, which are importantly very unpopular with staff. So sometimes the G77 will align with the staff unions, which is all to say the politics of human resources limits the autonomy of the Secretary General to pursue the kinds of policies that might create a more diverse and representative Secretariat. So just, I think I'll conclude there. I think that some other things to say about kind of civil society dynamics, but I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually a really important aspect as well with the whole civil society dimension of this. And thanks for going further into the details of gender parity. But of course, there are, it becomes even more both frustrating and complex if you also look at the whole age dimension. And of course, we should get back to that discussion as well. But let's first stay on sort of the more detailed discussion on perhaps the gender parity issue. Anne-Marie, you're part of the research team commissioned by UN Women to analyze the efforts on better reaching gender parity and staffing at all levels. So I understand this is ongoing research and you can't share everything with us, but there are certainly some of these things that could be probably brought out in daylight already. So we're ready to listen to you. So over to you now.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. I'm using a PowerPoint slide. Yes, I'm going to briefly go over the issues of gender and feminist leadership, actually, and feminist purpose at the UN. So gender parity and feminist purpose, not the same thing. And that's actually kind of one of the problems that I think we could address. But let me start by saying that actually feminists the world over have invested enormously in feminist multilateralism, in gender equality via multilateralism, and it's been going on for a long time. The Peace Conference of the International Women's Council in 1915 actually was, laid out many foundational principles for the League of Nations and was a huge support of it. And the International Council of Women also really stressed that the hopes and expectations of the world for peace and prosperity lay in equitable multilateralism. Of course, women at the time did ask for representation of women among delegations from countries and in the bureaucracy of the League of Nations, and were not successful in getting anything like a quota or anything like that. And moreover, there was a lot of resentment and resistance among the few women delegates who were there when they were assigned to women's issues, actually, the assumption that women delegates would necessarily handle women's issues. So the famous Helena Swanwick on the UK delegation complained about being assigned to what was then the Fifth Committee of the League of Nations, which handled a list of things such as orphans, opium, alcoholism, refugees, and women. And she called it a rag bag of miseries and forlorn hopes. And why do women get stuck with all this? So there's been a dramatic, really significant change. We've gone from the rag bag of miseries and forlorn hopes to striding the hallways of the high councils of international affairs. And there's been huge changes in women's leadership and in the representation of gender issues at the UN. The creation of UN Women, of course, is momentous, but there's complete parity in top leadership, as everyone has mentioned. UN leaders in field missions, in peacekeeping and special political missions, almost at parity, although the numbers of women at the crucial mid-level pipeline remain stubbornly low. There are all women teams heading some of the most difficult UN missions, such as Iraq, for instance, and Afghanistan recently. Police components are being headed by women and so on. And the 2017 system-wide gender parity strategy has a lot to do with this. So yes, I'm part of a team that was asked by UN Women to give a independent external assessment on the implementation of the strategy. Here are my colleagues, some of them may join our call. The team is organized by two NGOs, women's organizations called Gender at Work and the Collective for Research and Training on Development. I am not, however, speaking for the team, and I am not at liberty really to talk about our findings. I will be using one or two pieces of data from some of the research so far. So the thing about the commitment to gender, and I know that that's just one slice of diversity, but it's been a very rocky road. The UN has made many promises in the past to reach gender parity quickly. So there was a General Assembly resolution in 1994 saying that by the year 2000, we're going to be at 50-50. Well, that date came and went, and there was no real reckoning with the fact that no serious efforts had been taken. And for a long time, the majority of senior appointments continued to go to men in a very relatively unchallenged way. And the problem is so severe that, and especially as I mentioned at the mid-level of mission management, UN mission management, that in 2017, this is one of the things that prompted the dramatic gender parity strategy of Antonio Guterres. In 2017, it was estimated that it would take 700 years at this rate of growth to reach parity at the D2 level and mission leadership. So that triggered the 2017 gender parity strategy, which is aiming to reach full parity in all parts of the UN at all levels in 2028. And this is just a quick chart by my colleague Fotini Papagiotti and Paul von Chamier at the Center for International Cooperation to show what a huge difference you can see in the proportion of women appointed by each different Secretary General. Quite dramatic, I think you would agree. And you can actually get details of this and more on the interactive dashboard produced by the Center for International Cooperation and where I work, the Center for Global Affairs. They have this dashboard. What you can do is you can, this is not live here, so I can't adjust it, but I think you can see my arrow. You can actually look at how the numbers on gender parity over time and how it's changed over time. And you will see here that this is all senior appointments. The share of Western Europe and other group, if you like, the Global North in senior appointments is overwhelming. And that remains a sort of site of imbalance. Now, I do want to acknowledge the extraordinary and rapid success of the gender parity strategy. In a few short years, it has achieved what people thought was impossible. A former HR director said, you know, when I saw these ambitious goals, I did not think it was possible. In a few short years, absent even very hard accountability tools, the Secretary General has made it clear that he's not going to tolerate the continued sidelining of qualified women for posts at all levels in all parts of the system. And I guess, you know, there's lots of things in the gender parity strategy. I'm almost out of time now, so I don't have time to go into it. But, you know, there's all kinds of creative things, training, culture change, addressing some of the obstacles. I'll get into that in a second. But I think the really significant thing is that all hiring managers have to explain themselves now. They have to explain themselves and explain why they didn't hire a woman, basically, is what it comes down to. There is a formal procedure. If you hire a man for a sector that has few women in it, why'd you do it? Did you try hard enough? Was there enough outreach to look for qualified women candidates? What is the justification for doing this? So it's an extraordinary measure to require this. And it has, as we've seen, made a difference. Now, only 10 of the UN entities representing, you know, a fair chunk of staff, almost 8,000 staff, have reached parity or better. The vast majority, 30,000 staff, are in a range of entities that are not quite at 50%, but are up to 40%. Now, let's be realistic here. Any private sector organization that had these figures would be proud, actually, in many cases, in many organizations, to have between 40 and 49% women. But of course, the trouble is, as Marta Helena said, as ASG Lopez said, a lot of the time, the concentration of women is found in lower levels and in feminized occupations. Henrik, am I already out of time? Is that what you're about to tell me? Okay. There is a tricky little sneaky thing here. My arrow is hovering here over an entity called UN, where the figures look good, 44%. Actually, this package here is the entire secretariat, all the field missions, dozens of entities that are under the secretariat, where the overall figures are not quite as good as that average looks. So challenges that are being faced, well, there's a whole series, and some have been mentioned, and they're both internal and external. There is, particularly for UN field missions, there is contradictory pressure. The gender parity strategy has been introduced at a moment of dramatic downsizing of missions. Missions have downsized by 45% in terms of staff numbers since 2010. A lot of those people have permanent and continuing contracts and expect a career in the UN. And often there's pressure, there's directly contradictory pressure to place those people in jobs when there is an opening, which is rare enough in shrinking missions or small new missions. So there's that problem. The people who have permanent and continuing contracts do tend to be more male than female. There is a real issue about work-life balance, and this was alluded to by ASG Lopez, the non-family duty stations and what that means for women. I'm going to show you a chart. I'm just jumping ahead to the next page. This was produced by my colleague Fotini Papagiotti in our team. Now, these are not proportionate numbers, but what this chart shows you is the lack of sync or synchronicity between the career cycle that is expected of an international civil servant and the life cycle that is expected of women and men. So the international civil servant career and life cycle works just fine together if you are a man with an unemployed spouse who is prepared to travel around the world with you and your children, or who is prepared to be left behind somewhere with your children. It works great. But for women, that cycle doesn't work, including the cycle of childbearing years. So here what we see is that women start dropping out of the system at 40. You may have had a couple of kids, start running into challenges, juggling not just childcare, but the sandwich of elder care as well. And women start plummeting out of the system after this age, whereas men plummet out of the system at retirement. I know I'm short of time, so just in terms of backlash, there are some creative measures that have been deemed discriminatory, such as issuing all women calls for certain kinds of jobs, such as jobs that are highly male dominated, such as ASG Lopez mentioned, like IT or security. And by the way, all male calls could be issued under the gender parity strategy, frankly, for female dominated jobs, such as the G staff. The caste distinctions have been mentioned in UN families that limit migration across families. Other obstacles have been mentioned, politicized appointments and so on, lack of funding. So I'm not going to go on to that.
Please don't stress. This is extremely important. So shall I take your time?
Okay, I was stressing. Okay, all right, I was stressing. All right, so I'm just going to now finish off with 2 slides on some of the cultural and environmental issues that are raised a lot by the women who leave, the promising women who leave. And they actually link the issue, I think, of gender parity or representation, composition of staff. They link it to the purpose of the organization and whether the purpose of the gender parity strategy is just a numbers game, jobs for the girls, as many men have derisively called it, or is the purpose of the gender parity strategy about changing the purpose of the organization. The gender parity strategy document itself is not super clear on this. And the communication of the strategy is also not super clear. And so this is an area where actually there could be some constructive lessons to be learned from the kind of conversation we're having. So some of these environmental and cultural issues include a huge sexual harassment problem, which is under the surface and not mentioned. Nobody talks about it, or very few, because of the fears of reprisals, and it's kind of a career-ending move if you raise it. There's also a new problem, which we're hearing from senior women, which is very serious: insubordination and contempt. Not sexual harassment, but bullying and insubordination from male peers and subordinates. And so this leads us to think that actually there needs to be some thought put into feminist leadership and the issues that ASG Lopez raised about dignity and respect, and what does this all have to do with the UN's purpose. And the reason it's so important to be addressing this just now, and now I will, I think, finish on this slide. The reason it's so important to address this right now, it has to do with some of the issues Hannah raised, which is, what are these elite bureaucrats supposed to do in these jobs? They're not just conference organizers. Let's be honest. We know that, you've got some of them who have de facto frontline street level jobs, but there are also many others, like myself when I worked at UN Women, who actually see their jobs as advocating for the UN's goals and are committed, dedicated, frankly, bureaucratic activists. In my group, we call that femocrats. And these people are there to actually advance the UN's agenda. And we know that the UN is actually being employed by some member states and conservative NGOs to advance an anti-gender equality agenda. And it's very serious and it's very evident. And there's been some very interesting writing about coordination amongst member states on norm spoiling around gender equality and human rights more broadly. And this is a very interesting quote from a recent article I just saw. We are looking at a group with the potential to alter not only the global course of women's rights, but also how politics is done within the UN. And that is producing divergence and polarization internationally amongst member states in terms of their interest in gender issues and the salience of gender issues to global affairs. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was extremely both important and interesting. And thanks for also showing the power of data. I mean, this data is a reason why we can monitor what is actually happening and understand a lot better. And so, of course, this type of data is also needed for all other types of representation that we're also struggling to address. And I'm coming back to that later, but let's turn to Lysa now, also to get a better understanding also on cultural and structural changes that could facilitate increased representation and also civic participation. So I'm going to cut myself short here because we want to listen to you, Lysa. So over to you.
So I'm delighted that I'm speaking after Anne-Marie because she's actually provided me with all of the opening lines I need to connect my piece, which is completely external to the UN, to the conversations that are happening here about, just reform and leadership and essentially the impact, right, and the politics of the UN. So I think from where I sit, and because I work with civil society organizations and activists in all their diversity across countries, there's a really strong sense that the call for reform, which we've seen in the last year, particularly with the We the People's campaign in terms of upgrading and changing the nature of business of the UN, but also the trends that we are seeing in CIVICUS produces a report, an annual State of Civil Society report, which is currently in its 10th edition, and we've actually summarized how social movements and civil society are working across the last decade and what trends we're seeing for the future. And that piece of work particularly points to the fact that the issues of legitimacy, of trust, of actually being able to speak to and address the most important issues of our times, which have been captured really well in the Sustainable Development Goals framework, and is essentially addressing inequality and sustainability in complex and forward-looking ways, and with solidarity and diversity at the heart of all of our responses to these global problems. And I think in doing that, there's a real sense that there is a very, very important piece of work in terms of changing the identity, the internal identity and the internal capacity issues of the UN, but there's an equally important piece of work in ensuring that the demand for that change is as diverse, as powerful, and as mainstreamed as possible. So some of the suggestions that have actually come out of the expert roundtables, and I know Maria Fernanda Espinosa was there in a conversation yesterday that we had on this, have really been about radically reforming engagement and civic participation with the UN. And I'm specifically not using the word civil society because we tend to think of civil society as organized, formal groups that look exactly like us, that come from the same economic, educational, experiential kind of stratas as those of us around the table. That is not the kind of engagement we're talking about. We're talking about really strong, diverse, hardcore public engagement, which is also legitimized through elected representatives, through forms of democracy that exist across the world. And I think doing that really requires a completely different persona of the UN, a completely different, if I can use the name, brand personality of who works in the UN. It really has to be a person who understands leaderless movements, who understands that people are no longer being organized by these great hierarchical power exuding figures. The agency that individuals have today in the world is the highest that we have ever seen in any generation. Every person on the planet, no matter where they are, even in the most restricted context, and we do run a CIVICUS monitor which tracks civic freedoms and the opportunity to exercise freedoms across the world. But even in the most closed locations and countries, people are finding ways to organize and demand their rights. And the more governments react with fear and with control and with repression, the more ways people find to push back and to claim, and to assert their belief in economic, political, and environmental justice. So I think there's a real need for a completely new nature of working within the UN, which then requires us to really challenge the domination of northern powers, the way that narrow nationalism is used to block decisions, to prevent any kind of really forward-looking or really powerful or radical change or solutions to the complex problems that we face. And I think that sense of the organization really being trapped in that kind of inertia, or trapped, in relation to those vested interests is very, very apparent. And it's particularly apparent now because of the pandemic, because of the inequality of access to vaccines, because of the way that, world leaders have basically failed publics across the world in their ability to demonstrate that they truly care about humanity and about human survival. And therefore the demand for particularly the UN more than any other global institution in the world to step up and show the leadership that the entire planet is like desperate to experience right now is extremely high. There have been surveys in the last year on this, and there's been quite a strong demand for a new form of multilateralism that's actually people powered and responds to the issues of people on the ground rather than to the demands or the agenda of governments themselves. And I think in doing that, what Anne-Marie, what you said about feminist leadership, it's absolutely at the center of that. But feminist leadership in a very and truly intersectional way. So women of color, women from economically challenged backgrounds, women who've actually experienced the complexities of different issues. I know, as somebody who leads an international alliance, I go to many, many meetings, and in most of the meetings, I'm the only woman of color who lives and works in the global South, talking about global development and rights. So I think that change really has to happen fairly quickly. In my own spaces, in most of the networks I engage with, my own organization, we're generally very strong on the participation of women or non-binary groups to some extent, but at least our narrative is strong on that. But we're not very strong on actually accepting the thought leadership of people who've lived in the global South. And even for me, in my own experience as a woman leader, I've been told numerous times that there's simply such strong assumptions about competency, there's such strong assumptions about leadership that are linked to the global North, that are linked to the notions of the white male, basically, that it's very, very hard to kind of break those biases down. And if that's true of organizations in civil society, I can only imagine how true that might be of the more traditional government kind of powered and resourced organizations, which kind of mirror many of those structures of hierarchy and control. So having said that, all I can say at this point is there is a force for change on the streets, on everywhere across the world, that is simply just too impatient with the slow pace of work of institutions. So I was on another conversation earlier today with the leads of the World Bank and the IMF. And I think simply, the fact that people just feel that they don't have the time to wait for organizations and institutions to make changes at their own little pace anymore. And it's been brilliant, therefore, to see how quickly the gender parity strategy has been advanced within the UN, but there's a lot more to do. And the UN's best ally in this is really the people on the ground, because it's the people on the ground who will hold their governments accountable, who will challenge them and force them to resource and drive the changes that you want to see within the UN itself. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lysa. And thanks for also providing some other dimensions and moving us sort of further beyond sort of what representation must be about. And I think we need to come back later also to both age and geographical representation in this discussion. But let's first now, since we have the true pleasure of having Maria Fernandez-Pinoza with us. You were former president of the United Nations General Assembly, PGA. The theme, if I recall it correctly, on the year was, or the whole presidency, was making the United Nations relevant for all people. I mean, that takes its sort of point of departure also in sort of recognizing diversity and representation. So, Maria, when you hear this, I mean, so much of this is familiar to you, but now when you're out of that role you had, how would you like to comment on this, and what is sort of standing out to you in these presentations? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Henrik, and thank you to ACONS, of course, and to the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation for for this conversation. This is not an easy conversation to have, quite honestly, and I really thank the panelists today, because it was an incredible, eye-opener and a learning experience. And on one hand, we see that we are making great strides. For example, on the gender parity efforts from the Secretary General. I'm a witness of his true commitment and how much we have advanced in having women in senior level positions. And of course, that has to trickle down also to the mid-level, to the ground people, to our peacekeeping operations, where other representation of women is less than 7%. So I think that in a way, I think that, and I was so glad to hear Marta Helena saying that diversity is part of the core values of the UN, and that has to be reflected in its workforce. And I know it's easy to say, difficult to do. So I commend you, Marta Helena, for the efforts that the organization is doing on that front. But basically, I would like to share 3 reactions to what I have heard. And number one is that why is that we want a workforce at the UN that is diverse and that represents different regions, different genders, etc. And I think that the structural issue, the key question is how the UN takes decisions, sets priorities, deliver and implements on the ground in a way that was said, I think it was Anne-Marie or Hannah saying that a public organization has to be a mirror of the people it serves. And I think that the UN has a long way to go to be the mirror of the people it serves in all ways. And I think that this is the reason why we are here. It's not just to have the numbers right, to have the charts right, but to understand how is that the organization operates, takes decisions, the leadership of the organization, how well it represents the we the people's part of the charter. And that is connected also to the legitimacy, to the transparency, to the accountability of the organization, and in how close the UN is of the people we serve. That's why I came up with this motto, Henrik, to make the UN relevant for all. And this is very much has to be reflected in the way the public service at the UN is shaped and organized. So I would say that there are several obstacles. I really like when Hannah said, well, I had people from different countries that I worked with, but they all came from the London School of Economics. And that is so powerful because it means that the UN is an organization of elites from different countries in a way. And that also has to be addressed and tackled. And what are the obstacles? I have seen obstacles in quality of education, especially in the global South, accessibility for persons with disabilities. I put together a task force when I was president to provide specific recommendations to the Secretary General on inclusion of persons with disabilities. Language. We are very much an English-dominated organization. It's always a struggle when you ask for translation, and sometimes language matters very much so, because it's connected to culture, it's connected to means of expression. And I think that also needs to be taken into account. We have 5 official languages at the UN, but they do not always work, and we have always this issue about the costing and the budgeting, and that it has to be in English because we don't have resources for translation, etc., etc. But in my opinion, when there is shortage of resources, it's the symptom, it's not the problem. The problem is the political will and the political commitment. And that leads me to perhaps the third issue, which is the funding architecture of the UN. And this is the funding of the UN is $3 billion per year, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps Helena knows better, but it's like a medium-sized company budget to resolve all the main problems of humanity. And most of the budget of the UN comes from, not from the assessed budget, but from earmarked budget. Sometimes, not always, but earmarked money is for specific themes, but also for specific stuff from with the particular countries of origin. And that doesn't help the work that Maria Elena has to do. Particular positions, particular projects, particular themes that are, like, in a way, the responsibility of a particular country. So we need predictable assessed budget that is sufficient enough to fund a full-fledged public international service that would reflect and be the mirror of the people we serve. And I really think that it is not only about public service at the UN, it is about an effort that has to come from member states. And I really liked the reference to feminist foreign policies. Being a foreign minister of my country twice, I know that it is critical for feminist affirmative action diplomatic careers in our countries of origin to start with. If you look at the gender division of labor, looking at the main committees of the UN, look at the first committee on disarmament, how many women are there? And I think that there are numbers there. I had some notes here, but it's very low. And when you look at the third committee, which is social development, et cetera, then you immediately have a larger number of women diplomats taking care of that. And that reminds me of the League of Nations that you mentioned about women having to deal with specific issues. And I think we need to de-genderize in a way the themes, the committees work, and that is the responsibility of member states. And let's look at presidents of the General Assembly. In 76 years of history, only 4 women presidents of the GA. And I'm proud to say that the 4 women presidents have come from Global South countries. We all came, India, Liberia, Bahrain, and myself, the first from Latin America. So that reflects that there is a long way to go on the gender division of labor within the UN, but also from the side of member states on the intergovernmental part. And as I said, and I would like to close with that, is to say that this is not only about fairness on numbers and quotas. It is about the quality of our capacity to deliver. It is about being the mirror of the people we serve. Again, it is about transparency and accountability. And I'm also worried about the issue of harassment in all its forms, including gender harassment. I'm very encouraged to see that there is a task force looking at racism and discrimination within the UN. This is also something that it's there. And we need to address it seriously. I know it's a tough call, but it's something that we need to be very very active and outspoken on that. And just to close, to say, you know, incremental change. And unfortunately, I don't think we have the 700 years that someone mentioned. You know, in the same way we have shown gender parity results in such a fast pace, I think we can start showing transformation and not incremental change in other fronts. And for example, on regional representation. And we have to be careful because regional representation sometimes covers the lack of participation and representation of certain countries. Sometimes they say, oh yes, Latin America is represented because there are two countries that are very big in our region. They're big, so whatever happens, they say, oh, you're represented because these two countries are already there. But, you know, let's look at, you know, the Caribbean, 14 countries, small countries like my own, Ecuador, how many Ecuadorians, et cetera, et cetera. So this has to be looked at in a more granular way, you know, in terms of the data we handle. And very also happy to see that we're taking care of gender diversity, of ethnic, religious diversity. I think it's a much and urgent needed effort that the UN has to do. I would just leave it there and thank you again for everything that I have learned today. And back to you, Henrik, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I would like to just call out, you know, if you want to raise questions or comment on what's been said, please either use your just sort of the hand function, the virtual hand, or use the chat box. But this is also a meeting that is recorded, so it will be used also for being able to sort of access from the outside. We will also use part of this in our own work and make it sort of a reference. I have a comment from Fanny. I'll let you in just a second. I think it's really important. That's what was been raised in all of these sessions. I'm very glad that we have sort of recognized sort of, yes, it might be an incremental approach, but it is also, we must understand that this is completely unacceptable what we see. And some of the progress that's been proven by data and that we know is also challenged today, especially when it comes to women's rights. Thank you, Maria, also for raising the sort of the political dimension of this and the political sort of importance of having, you know, for instance, a feminist foreign policy. Coming from Sweden, where that policy was very much active and still is, that rested on 3 R's, and it was rights, representation, and resources. And that is something that sort of echoes in this whole sort of setup around representation and diversity. Another thing that I pick up when you speak, and also listening to Lysa, is the whole need to yes, we can talk about inclusivity. We do a lot of work on that when it comes to fragile state settings, and we conclude often that this is recognized but seldom sort of realized, and that's the same in this. And I think as I've said, I think we should take a little bit more time to look into gender, sort of geographical representation. After all, more than 50, close to 60 countries are not represented at all, and in levels where they need to be represented as member states. We also need to look at the whole phenomenon around age. If we look at sort of how demographics looks like, the UN is certainly not reflecting that. There are also this whole sort of discussion around sort of, yes, we might have representation, but it's also, we need to move beyond elites. So plenty of topics to pick up on, but let me turn to Fanny Badachi. So I'll ask you to unmute and present who you are and raise your questions.
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm going to try with the video, but I'm not sure my connection will work, so I'm going to try. As Hannah mentioned, I've worked for the last 5 years on the topic of geographical diversity for my PhD dissertation, and now I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Goetz Institute in Geneva. So I would like to make a comment mainly on the topic of geographical diversity because it's really my focus. And I think the biggest strength of this roundtable is to make a distinction between the concept of diversity and the concept of representation, because diversity is about looking at the composition of a team in absolute terms. So what's the composition? Whereas representation is about assessing the composition of the workforce vis-a-vis towards the baseline, in relation to the baseline. And I think what the UN does when it comes to geography is only about representation, because there's all this political background, the politics here. But I think what would be meaningful to have some progress on in terms of figures, in terms of also content of policies and actually how people work, is to go towards the geographical diversity. So to stop measuring and to stop assessing the composition of the workforce vis-a-vis contributions or population, etc. And I would like to know, maybe, I don't know if, I know it's very hard to change it because member states are really keen on this system of desirable ranges. But I've heard from one of my interviewees that the UN may have set up a working group on in discussing a kind of reform of adopting new measures on geographic diversity. And I would like to know if there has been any evolution on this topic. Thank you very much, and thank you again for this roundtable.
Thank you very much, Fanny. And it's hard to just call someone out on this, but perhaps Martha, Helena, you are the sort of the most qualified person to speak about this. I understand it's not easy to sort of provide sort of a full sort of an answer that sort of reflects the full complexity of this question. But would you like to have a try at least?
Okay, thank you. So first of all, just to clarify that the geographical representation only applies to one segment of our international positions, not to the entire segment of our international positions. So we do need to juggle between that group of positions and the rest of the group where we have more leeway to bring different people in. And we have made efforts to increase the geographical representation, but just to give you one example that also leads to one comment earlier, it also has to bear in mind the different countries and the context of those countries. So when we do outreach, we do not try, particularly in big countries, we don't try only to go to the capital city. We do need to go to other cities within that country so that we can have the diversity of that country also represented in the organization. And I think last year we had already been doing it when we went on outreach visits to go to different cities within the country. But last year, what we started to do is also to reach out to universities in smaller cities. Because we can bring them together virtually. So it gives the opportunity to reach out to different ethnicities and different backgrounds of the same country. So we feel that is also important. We're working a lot with member states, but we're also working a lot with our staff members within. So for those countries that are underrepresented, we reached out to those staff members who could also help us be advocates for others to join the organization. And we also reached to the locally recruited staff members going forward. But last year, I think it was a beautiful year in terms of advancing a lot of our agenda. In terms of disability, I think we were able to also be able to have different, as the year went along, we started to have all these platforms being with caption also. And so that also brought in a lot of individuals that were hearing impaired to be able to join the workforce. But perhaps for me, the most important is that the barriers of the different levels came down. And so when a USG may have had an office or an ASG of 8 windows and a lower level staff would not have a window, we all had the same space on the screen. And I think that gives us bring the structures down for a period of time. And I think that also is important to see how we can, when we go back to the office, how we can also bring that in. So thank you again, Henrik, for this very interesting conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Martha Helena. And I will quickly turn to Luciana. I'll ask you to unmute yourself, present yourself, and if you have a short question, we are running out of time. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Luciana. I'm a scholar and from the Global South. I'm based in the Dourados, the third biggest city in receiving Venezuelan migrants. So I have a connection with the Operação Acolhida, which is the humanitarian response to that. Before that, I know Fanny. I've been doing work on UN reform since 2010, and with UN country teams and bullet funds since 2010. I was an intern in Vietnam, WHO office in 2011. So it's a long career. Right now, my question was, how geographic representation is actually geographic diversity? Because what we often see is that we see the global south people that it's based and fully trained on the global north. On the other hand, I'm based now in a small city next to Paraguay, and we are in a very acute crisis with the Venezuelan migrants. And we have many UN agencies. We have the International Organization for Migration, we have UNHCR, we have UNICEF, we have UN Women, and it's also the largest urban indigenous tribal in the world. It's the same city. So actually we have the staff of the UN, which we have really good staff, but most of them was based on the big city, on a cosmopolitan city, and used to work with norms, with laws, with policies, and now are dealing with completely different context. So how do you manage adapting the staff to this changing context? And how do you actually have people that have experience on the ground where things happen and not where decisions are made, which is the capitals and the big city centers?
Thank you very much, Luciana. We are running over time and we only have like a minute or two and then we need to close. So I will ask any one of you, Martha Helena, Hanna, Anna Maria, Lisa, or Maria, just to quickly just respond to perhaps this question, but also in general, if we were to make sort of a wish list or a watch list, what needs to happen now? What do we need to keep our eyes on? Because we need to move on, but we need to continue this discussion. So over to you for a very, very quick sort of a couple of 20 seconds, and then we'll wind up. So who wants to go first? Can I turn to you, Hanna?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. And speaking to what Luciana was saying, I'd say two issues that I think are very important. One is about gatekeeping. For all of this, it's actually really hard to get into the UN. You get in when you know people. And so thinking about how those kinds of things work, I think, Martha Helena is looking at processes and advertising, but that's crucial. And then the second thing is follow the money. All of these things have budgetary implications. The politics of the budget is really significant here. And it has also tended to be dominated by men. So I'd say feminists in the Fifth Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. To pass over the baton to Anna Maria.
Actually, I think Lisa was before me.
All right. Sorry, Lisa. Sorry.
Go ahead. No problem.
I will stay with you, Lisa.
Yeah, I think it's for you, Lisa.
Let me jump. I mean, not from the perspective of the UN, but I think just generally across all sectors that actually serve publics, there's been an overwhelming sense that we've deprioritized the ability to directly engage with people. So the people who actually mobilize, who organize, who render services at the front lines are the least paid and the least protected. And we know that from the pandemic as well. But on the other hand, what we've seen is that the first to respond during the pandemic, I mean, civil society at least has become hyper-local. global organizations haven't been able to respond the way that local organizations have been responding, and the value of community leadership and community organizing and networking, even though there hasn't been a financial cost put to it, that's what lives are depending on right now. And I think the ability of the UN to recognize that, and when I said earlier about the brand personality of the UN, that has to be the brand personality of leadership in the UN, not just the frontline workers. And I think that's true for all international organizations, whether in the UN or outside.
That's very true indeed. Anna-Marie.
I'll be super quick. A couple of points. One, the gender parity strategy has not been very successful at geographic diversification. So of the women senior leaders, there's even more of them from Western Europe and other group than there are of men senior leaders. So that's a real issue. The gender parity strategy, if it were to focus on elevating women national staff, which is in its phase 2, which has not been implemented, that would help enormously to answer some of your questions about the elite bias. And the last thing I wanted to say is the dashboard I showed you earlier, I've just posted a link to it in the chat. One of the things that we haven't explored yet regarding senior leaders since 1995 to now, but we found this, is Hannah's point is not just anecdotal. All of the senior leaders at the UN, most of them anyway, have been to the same schools, and you can guess which ones they are for the Anglo world and the Francophone world. And those are the elite universities in those worlds. So that actually is an interesting sign of self-cloning, elite self-cloning. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Maria, would you like to say something? And then the last word to Martha Helena after that.
Well, I think that the last word should be in the hands of Martha Helena because she's the doer of this. But I think that we have a golden opportunity because we are, responsible for co-building this our common agenda in the UN reform process. And I think that organizations are about humans working inside these organizations. It is about the human dimension of the work of the UN, what is going to really make the difference. And I think that we have a responsibility. It is not only the executive of the UN, the Secretary General and his team, it is about the engagement of civil society, of young scholars like Luciana, for example, and Fanny, to really, speak up and provide the wisdom and the guidance that are needed. And we're very, very happy that this is being part of the conversation. It's not only about creating new bodies or improving the participation of civil society. Is about an all-encompassing, a human perspective on this new common agenda that we are to build in the coming years. So reform and transformation is, I think, now the way to go. And thank you. And back to you, Henrik, for the last word from Martha Helena.
Yes, and we'll pass directly over. Martha Helena.
Thank you. And thank you for this enriching discussion. I think it has been very enlightening in many sense. I think I'll look at more at the future, but also based on what has happened in the last few years. And no matter how much the geographical diversity we have and others, it's more the experiences of each one of them. And those, for example, last year that it was easier and we could see that they connect out were those that were mobile, and go to a bit to Luciana, those that had had different experience and that they were not afraid of handling the unknown. We were traveling through an unknown period. And what was more important last year, I think, was that no matter where we were all in this together, and from different angles, and we worked it out together. We made mistakes, but what we tried was to control what we knew. And you can see the diversity that came around there. You had a diversity of a collective effort, geographical, gender, countries. Every single duty station, for the first time in the UN, we were affected. we were not handling outside stresses, we were handling inside stresses. So it was the collective effort of different minds, different ages, people with disabilities, everyone trying to make this work. And I think if we were only from one country, only from one family, we would not have made it work. So I think that is the beauty where diversity last year really helped us navigate going forward. And it was a challenge, but I think we have advanced more than ever. So thank you for the opportunity, Henrik.
Thank you very much, Helena, Lopez. Thank you to all of you that have participated and also listened in to this session. This is certainly an extremely important discussion. It doesn't stop here. We must learn a lot about the fantastic progress that's been made on gender parity, but so much needs to be continued to be focused on, and it needs to be informing also other areas such as geographic and age representation. Also, we need to defend actually the progress that's been made. So this discussion must continue, and we will do what we can from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation to stay focused on this and keep bringing this dialogue back. It's all about sort of both the integrity of the system and also about ethics, about how the system works. But most important, it is how to reflect the UN Charter and reflect how the world's demographics looks like today. If you want an organization that reflects the world, it must reflect sort of both the dimension of representation and diversity. Thank you very much for listening. I hope we will continue this discussion together. Over and out.
Thank you. Bye-bye.